Now is the hour, now is the day. We take what we gather, set on our way, and hope for what's better. That's what people say, but words can't do nothing to keep tears away. We'll come by the mountains, cross over the streams, walk in the footsteps of others who've dreamed. Take your bag from the fire, your coat by the door, keep a light in the window, home, to find our way home. Home, to find a way home.
So welcome back after lunch, ladies and gentlemen. I think you'll agree we had a wonderful morning. We've got a packed lineup this afternoon. Similar format to the first session this morning, 4 speakers, 20 minutes each. Last speaker, 15 minutes, making a little bit more time for discussion. So please make a note. You've got a description of the speakers in your notes, so I won't go through those. Because it's the afternoon session, after the first speaker, there'll be a 20-second break where you'll be invited to stand up and do a star jump or talk to your neighbour, because to keep the circulation going this afternoon. It's a great pleasure to welcome Christine Kinealy to the podium. For those of you for whom she's a stranger, the description is in your programme. But I just want to say a word of appreciation at the beginning, because she was such a wonderful host at a difficult time for the symposium, in welcoming us right up to Quinnipiac. Have I said that right, Christine? No. Say it. Would you say it properly for everybody?
Quinnipiac.
And not Quinnipiac. And we referred to this last night. We were talking about the history of the symposium, but that was kind of an epic 2-part, up at Quinnipiac and then down to Georgia, Athens in Georgia. And our second speaker was actually a veteran of that epic drive. But it's a great pleasure to welcome Christine. We had a lot about Liverpool this morning. Christina paid those wonderful maps of the sea routes. But a lot of the speakers this morning mentioned Liverpool as a nodal point in this global system that was developing of transport, part of the globalization process, I suppose, that's brought us to the point where the world's covered by the internet and now artificial intelligence. But Christine, come and talk to us about Liverpool. Give her a big welcome, please, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Liam. Thank you, Patrick. It's great to be back here. I was here in 2016. It was the time of the Brexit vote, so there are a lot of sad faces, I have to say, at breakfast. So sorry for being political. But also, I'm glad to be back. I lived in Belfast. I moved to Belfast in 1987. And I'm delighted to see some of the people I worked with then. So John Gilmore, Trevor Parkhill, and I worked with Patrick Fitzgerald's father. And I always like to say I knew Patrick when he was just a boy, and so I know him now, man and boy. He certainly has boyish charm. So, anyway, so I'm talking about Liverpool. I have lived in Liverpool. I'm going to Liverpool tomorrow, and it's a city I'm very fond of for a number of reasons. So there's a lot to say. I know I have 18 minutes. I'm going to try and say it very quickly. But last night, you heard Mark McGowan talk about some publications we've been involved with together, and one of them is Hunger and Hope, and it tells the story of the 1,490 emigrants who came from Strokestown Park Estate in 1847, and it's written by I think 4 different historians, and Mark asked me to do 2 chapters, and one chapter I did was Liverpool, so I looked at the case study of the Strokestown emigrants. So this is sort of evolved out of that study, and it's just a magnificent publication, not because of my chapters, but in terms of telling what happened to people on a micro level. And you probably know now there's a national famine way that accompanies this, which is soon to become a global famine way, which I can talk about later. So just, if you don't know Liverpool, who's been to Liverpool? Or who hasn't been to Liverpool? Oh, you've got a treat waiting for you. It's a great city. So Liverpool prior to 1845, Clarence Dock, going to talk about it, opened 1830, Waterloo Dock 1834. So you can see period of expansion in terms of docks. 1840, 25% of the population were Irish-born. So this is even before the famine. And it had the worst health record of anywhere in the United Kingdom. The average span of life was 18 years of age. So truly, truly shocking. Again, this is before the famine. Population 1841, almost 300,000. Seamen coming and going, obviously. Liverpool Union, the workhouse union, was what they call formed 1841 and could accommodate 3,000 people. And there had been a workhouse before. If any of you know the university, it's Brownlow Hill, close to the university. But with the 1834 new poor law unions were reorganised. And by 1845, Liverpool was the second largest city in the United Kingdom, and it was the largest port in the world. So it's very significant for so many reasons. But it really is a tale of two cities, because side by side with the great wealth of Liverpool, again, if any of you know Liverpool University in particular, Abercrombie Square, it's still one of those beautiful areas that was built early 19th century, but Liverpool was famous for its courtyards and its cellars. So a lot of the poor people lived in dreadful conditions within these cellars. And this is just, actually, it is from 1847, an artist who drew this, and you get a sense of the green fields and very heavily concentrated around the docks. So, when does Liverpool enter the famine story? Mostly it's in the wake, as everything is, of the second failure of the potato crop. And straight away the impact is felt on the numbers coming into Liverpool. And week ending, if you can't see this, 9th of December 1846, over 13,000 Irish immigrants from all parts of Ireland landed in Liverpool. And that compared with 888 a year before. So if any of you are mathematicians, you can work out it's a massive. And the London Times, no friend to the Irish at all, said the anticipated invasion of Irish pauperism has commenced, and blocked up Liverpool's thoroughfares with masses of misery. And straight away the language of the Times, it's not very welcoming, invasion of Irish pauperism. So to a large extent, that was the official view of these Irish people coming in. And that's the view of the old workhouse, Brownlow Hill. The workhouse authorities in Liverpool were quirky, and they like to call themselves the Select Vestry, but that is the workhouse authorities. Week beginning 4th to 9th of January, not even 1 week, they gave relief to almost 30,000 people, Irish-born, and almost over 18,000 of them were children. And again, when you try and dissect and see how many children emigrated, etc., it's pretty shocking. At this point, the vestry appealed to Parliament, and they said, we are coping with something nowhere else in England. Glasgow was similar, I have to say, but nowhere else in England is coping with. Can you please help us in some way? And time again, the British government said, no, you're on your own. And if any of you know the poor law system, the way in which it was set up, each poor law union was responsible for its own poor law rates in Ireland and in Britain. So again, that put a very, very heavy burden on the local systems of rate. Soup kitchens, we think of them in Ireland, but soup kitchens were set up on the streets of Liverpool, and interestingly, where they were set up near to the landing area, the Irish came in. And by the end of January 1847, soup kitchens were feeding between 25,000 and 26,000 people daily. And they said of that, more than 22,000 were destitute Irish persons. So you can imagine the impact on the city very, very quickly. And then, the saying, famine follows fever, it's fever follows famine. I blame my broken wrist for that, so I apologise. But we talk about fever sheds, I know in Montreal, etc. But fever sheds were established on the streets of Liverpool. So again, between the soup kitchens, the immigrants coming in, going out, and the fever sheds, it was visible. It was highly, highly visible. And Dr. Duncan, who is in some ways one of the heroes. He's the medical officer of Liverpool, the first medical officer to be appointed in the United Kingdom. It was his idea to open fever sheds. So fever sheds were on the streets of Liverpool before they were established in Canada, which is where we often think of the fever sheds. Summer 1847, emigration, peaked immigration to Liverpool. May 1847, almost 27,000. June, 26,000 people coming in. So you can imagine, again, a great strain on the resources of Liverpool. And again, something we think of in Ireland, maybe we think of in Grosse Ile, famine pits. There were actually famine pits in Liverpool that people, unmarked, unnamed, were just thrown into in large numbers. And again, estimates. But in one near Mulberry Street, it's estimated 3,000 people were just buried in one famine pit. So again, these are things we might think of in Ireland, maybe in Canada, but these were all on the streets of Liverpool, 1847. Again, appeal after appeal to the government to stop people coming in who were ill. And the government said, well, we'll establish 4 ships on the River Mersey, and people, if they're suspected to be ill, they can go to the ship and be quarantined. Again, this was all paid for by Liverpool taxpayers. The government had a very laissez-faire attitude in this case. And then back to the English Poor Law. Most immigrants who were coming through Liverpool were going on to North America, but they spent maybe 48, 72 hours in the city, as did the Strokestown people, and some of them picked up disease there. But interesting, because of the English Poor Law, if any of you know the law of settlement, you had to have established residency within England in order to apply for workhouse relief. And that residency took 6 years. So people who came January, February, March, whenever, had no right to stay or to get poor law relief. So again, and to me, this makes a mockery of the so-called United Kingdom, because Irish people had no right to relief in any part of Britain. And this led to deportation. So these appeals to the government did result in some legislation. In June 1847, the British government passed legislation which made it easier to send people back to Ireland. And in the next 6 months, over 15,000 Irish people were sent back from Liverpool to Ireland. And they were literally dumped at the ports where they arrived, Belfast, Dublin, Cork, etc. In Belfast, there was a Belfast Ladies Relief Association. You may have heard of the wonderful Mary Ann McCracken. She was one of the members. And they raised funds to help people who were dumped in Belfast to go to their homes. But again, what does it mean to be part of the United Kingdom? So again, deportation, nothing new. So where did they arrive? Again, if you know Liverpool, this area is pretty abandoned now, the dock area, and the Clarence Docks. They arrived in this, the Clarence Docks. And then they had to walk up the road to get to where they would depart from, which was the Waterloo Docks. So again, they had to spend time in the city they didn't know. And, I don't know what proportion, but certainly some of them would have been Irish speakers. Many of them would have been illiterate. And some of them thought they were in America. They didn't realise they were just in Liverpool. So how disorientating this whole process must have been. And in terms of the Strokestown emigrants that Mark and I would know best, they had walked from Strokestown to Dublin over 100 miles. We did it in 2019. It's gruelling. We did it in hotels overnight. And then they would have waited in Dublin and got the ship over to Liverpool. If any of you have ever sailed from Dublin to Liverpool, the Irish Sea is rough and mean. And they would have been on the same boats as ships carrying cattle. And the only difference was there was more regulation governing the carriage of cattle than there were of passengers. So they sailed, and then they arrive in Liverpool, and then they wait there, and then they go to America. So, just a really grueling, tedious, awful journey. And again, this is just from 1847, but you can see the whole dock area. I don't know if you can see the area towards me is the Clarence Dock, and the area in the middle is the Waterloo Dock. And again, having walked from Strokestown to Dublin, I was sick of walking, but that whole trekking of people, often without shoes, etc. So just exhausting. Just figures between 1846, 1852, an estimated 1.3 million people came through the Clarence Dock. Again, incredible number of people. Most of them were hoping to go to North America. Most of them did not intend to stay in England, and often it was the sickest or the poorest who were left behind. One aberration, and Mark is the expert on this, 1847, more people emigrated to Canada than the United States. Why? Because that year the United States said, we don't want your paupers, so they actually put a tax on people landing in ports like Boston, New York. So Canada really plays a vital role, particularly in 1847. And so Liverpool, really was the largest exporter of people in the world. And again, just one statistic, between 1830 and 1930, over 9 million emigrants sailed from Liverpool, bound for various parts of the world. So massive impact. And just to move on from that, I just want to talk briefly about some Liverpool notables. I don't want to call them heroes, but some people who commemorated in Liverpool. So this is Kitty Wilkinson, who was born in Derry, not too far away, and she pioneered the idea of being clean as a way of stopping disease, and she opened wash houses in Liverpool. And that actually was groundbreaking and was followed eventually by other cities. So she's the saint of the slums, Kitty. You can visit her, the cemetery where she's buried. Dr. William Duncan, first medical officer of health, and he believed that disease and poverty could be stopped if there was better housing. And he campaigned for an end to cellars, etc., etc. He coined the phrase, 1847, that Liverpool was a city of plague. That's how he described it for all these emigrants coming in. And he's actually, if any of you go to Liverpool, there is a Dr. Duncan pub, and it's actually very charming. So there it is. Somewhere to visit. William Rathbone, who definitely is one of my heroes, one of the Rathbone family, a name that's very frequently heard in Liverpool. They founded Liverpool University. They were Unitarians, very progressive, great abolitionists. He was a friend of Father Matthew and Daniel O'Connell, welcomed O'Connell there. But more importantly, Rathbone, if any of you have heard of the Jamestown that sailed from Boston to Cork in 1847, laden with food, he was asked by the New England Committee to go to Cork and to meet the ship and to distribute it. And he did that, and he played a magnificent role. So he is definitely my hero of the famine. More controversially, Reverend Hugh MacNeill, an Anglican priest, who even in his own church was seen as quite controversial. He was quite viciously and openly anti-Catholic. 1847, he published The Famine, a Rod of God, its provoking causes, its merciful design, in which he blamed Catholicism for the famine. It was the punishment of God, very much providentialist view, etc. Not the nicest of people, but his church was St. Jude's Church, and from the end of 1846, he collected large amounts of money. And as early as January 1847, he sent a ship full of food to Westport and up to Donegal to the west of Ireland. And every now and again I come across money from St. Jude's Parish. So throughout the famine, he raised money that he just sent to Ireland, despite his very evangelical views. Thomas Raffles, I'd never heard of him, but he was a congregational minister, and he raised money, an active abolitionist. He sent money to Ireland. And then, of course, Catholic priests, as you might expect, Father James Nugent, Liverpool's greatest apostle of charity. He'd just been ordained 1845, 1846, and he worked with the poor of Liverpool, opened ragged schools, etc. And he's one of the few people remembered. There's a beautiful statue of him near to Lime Street Station. And then Bishop James Sharples, who born in Liverpool and sent money throughout the famine. And a few other random people. Thomas Cullen, brother of Paul Cullen, lived in Liverpool. He sent money. And navvies who were building a local railway, they donated a day's wages. But again, Mark talked about it. I think this morning, people who give, that story is just so massive, and we tend to overlook England when we think of the donations who came in, but the donations were massive and cut across social class, religion, etc., etc. So they're just a few of them and some of the people involved in Liverpool. And then just to conclude, remembering in Liverpool, and when I started writing about the famine pre-1995, there were so few books on the topic, there were so few memorials, and that has really, really changed. But we know, I was saying about people being buried unmarked. Many of the Irish poor were actually buried under the Catholic churches, and it's thought St. Patrick's Church, 14,000 bodies are buried there. So again, incredible. But what also makes this church, St. Toxteth, incredible is that a number of priests who tended to these immigrants also died. And they're called the 10 martyr priests, interesting choice of words. And this stone to them was erected in 1898. Again, tying it in with other anniversaries. And they attended sick, caught typhus fever, and died in 1847. In fact, more priests from that parish died, and I'm sure from other parishes. And we would call them the frontline workers now, but these people put themselves at great risk by working with the Irish. So they were remembered, they were the first. The Great Famine Memorial, this wave of remembering after 1995, this was opened in 1998 by President Mary McAleese. It's in, again, if you know Liverpool, it's a church that was bombed in the Second World War, and they've just left it there as a shell. It's St. Luke's, but it's called the Bombed Out Church. And very, very simple inscription, and you can see its location in relation to the church. Very, very simple memorial. And then it was started in 1995, and then it really faded, but it's been revived very recently. So if you go to Liverpool, there is now a Liverpool Famine Trail you can take part in. And this is they've identified various locations. I would add a few more locations. Clarence Dock, I'm sorry I cut it off, I didn't mean to, but these are places associated with the famine. You can download it and do it, and you can drop in, stop, etc. So Liverpool Famine Trail, and in certain places they've put up a marker, and this is their marker in Irish and then in English. So if you see that, you know you're in Liverpool, and that's a famine marker. And this is Mulberry Street, which is the site of unmarked graves. So again, what you might expect in Ireland, maybe not in Liverpool. So just patterns and pathways. So my conclusions are, Liverpool is definitely part of the global famine story. And this has been more and more recognised. The National Famine Way, the Strokes Town, is now becoming a global famine way, and Liverpool is going to play an important part in that. Liverpool's role was multifaceted. It didn't just receive emigrants, it sent them back. It sent money to Ireland, so multifaceted. Liverpool, before the famine, was already overcrowded and disease-ridden. So coming in, this influx just exacerbated existing problems. For me, the important point, the English Poor Law discriminated against immigrants, even those who were from the United Kingdom, in denying them any right to relief within English or Scottish poor law system. The British government's policy of non or minimal intervention to assist famine victims extended to Liverpool. Even though Liverpool was suffering, and so obviously suffering, again, the attitude of the government is you have to depend on your own resources. And that is the policy that really came into play in Ireland after August 1847, when the Irish Poor Law was made the main vehicle for relief. And for the British government, the advantage was all relief would be paid for by local taxpayers. At that point, the British government tried to deny any responsibility. And then just finally, in 1847, Liverpool, the city of plague, became the city of death. Thank you.
Christine, thank you very much. Now, I promised you 20 seconds of permission to stand, stretch. Turn to your immediate neighbour and just say to them, what a brilliant paper that was. And we'll be back in 20 seconds. Just a bit of technical handover here. This is turning out to be a fascinating day, I think you'll agree. Christine's presentation put me in mind that Paddy and I were do you remember Scally's, where's Paddy? Do you remember, is he slipping? Scally's satellite, Robert Scally writing about Liverpool. And this very interesting experiment, thought experiment. So imagine you were able to look at the surface of the Earth from a satellite from space in the early 19th century and track human movement across the surface of the Earth. What would you see? And he says, well, Liverpool would appear as a... Well, it reminded me of William Rollston and the bees this morning, a hive of activity. This is swirling activity. This is a central node in a developing global system. And Brian started us off this morning by talking about the port of Derry and how it was pioneering hub in the development of this system. William talked about the part of the diaspora. If we're thinking about the homeland and the diaspora, Toronto, and then Christina talked us. She brought us out, widened the network out to Bremen and the connection with Liverpool and points west. Daniel talked to us about took us to Maryland. Mark McGowan took us to Cavan in Ontario. Mary and Tom took us to the various parts of the Cavan diaspora. Elaine took us to Minnesota. And Christine's now taking us to Liverpool. And next we're going to another part, sort of neglected. Now Patrick is, I said he's a stalwart of the Symposium. A very fine scholar, and we're delighted to have him come to talk to us about. I think this is part of your field work in South Africa, is it?
Yeah.
Please do come to the podium and talk to us about the Irish in South Africa.
The Irish in South Africa.
Welcome to the podium, please.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Okay. Might notice the title's a little bit different from the one in the program. Instead of the land the Irish forgot, it's now the land that forgot the Irish, and I'll talk about that in a second. Just to see where we are here, South Africa, most of the places I'll be talking about, Northern Cape, Western Cape, Eastern Cape, that's the main area that we'll be talking about. Twice the size of France, about 62 million people. And the genesis of this presentation came from 2016. In 2016, we did a walking tour of Oma. And one of the things that we saw was the Boer War Memorial. It's on Dumra Avenue. It's just across from the train station, kind of in a little nook. It's often called the Hidden Monument, not too far from the Memorial Gardens and that. And so the one on the right is the Boer War Memorial in Enniskillen in front of the castle, a little more prominent. But as we were standing there, I noticed Jay Ireland is one of the people who was killed at Colenso in South Africa, and I noticed it because of the name. Most of my ancestors were from Down or Antrim, but there was a branch that ended up in Ballygolly, so he could be a relative. But it surprised me because whenever I thought of the Irish in connection with the Boer War, it was fighting on the Boer side, right? And so that was in my mind. And then I'm on sabbatical this year, and a big chunk of my sabbatical was spent at the Stellenbosch Institute for Advanced Study, which is a really good deal because they fly you there, they put you up, they feed you, and all they ask is that you work on your project undisturbed. It's the middle of wine country, there's a vineyard on the Institute grounds, right? But what I found out was one of the most terrifying things in the world is to have no other responsibility except to write a book. I was working on a book on migrants from West Africa. And so I'm like, I need a diversion. And I thought about this Jay Ireland guy. What I knew about South Africa was there weren't supposed to be any Irish there. But I kept seeing Irish place names, Irish street names, and it felt like a place where there would be Irish people. So I decided to explore that, and I think it hooks up pretty well with the topic that we're looking at in this symposium, because a lot of this has to do with the mechanics logistics, right? How that determined where people went. The places that we'll be talking about here a lot, just to situate you, Clan William up here, you see Cape Town, you see the Cape Peninsula, Stellenbosch, False Bay, Caledon, Stanford. These are the type of places I'll be talking about. This is mostly in the Western Cape. But I'll be talking about the rest of the country as well. Scholarship on South Africa, there's not a lot, but most of the people that have talked about migration from Ulster have talked about South Africa. So Donald McCracken is sort of the guy who's really worked the most on Irish migration in South Africa. He calls the Irish in South Africa the cream of the Irish diaspora. More about that later. It's because they're wealthier. They're smaller and wealthier. Atkinson, this is where I got the original title and the current title, The Land That the Irish Famine Forgot, because all these places people went during the famine years, very few went to South Africa. And then Colin Barr, who's now at Notre Dame, was at Aberdeen for a long time, calls the Irish the lost tribe of Southern Africa. So it's an interesting case because it's really the only permanent settlement of Irish people on the African continent. There's been some work done. What I'm presenting is nothing revolutionary. It's just sort of looking at the issue. And I basically took time, like on weekends and that, and went out to look to see if I could find any traces of this, why these names were there, was there any legacy of the Irish that had been there. And so if we go back to the early presence in the Cape Colony, was originally Dutch, of course, became British for a short period, 1795, 1802, and then definitively in 1806. And then in 1910, we have sort of self-government. British replacing the Dutch. There were already some Irish there, mostly people that were sailors, right, or military. And the first group of Irish people that we run into are these early governors with an Irish background, Anglo-Irish, right? So we've got George Macartney, the first Earl Macartney from Antrim. He's the one who had the quote about the sun never setting on the British Empire after the end of the 7 Years' War. Dupré Alexander, the second Earl of Caledon from Derry. He was there during a very famous slave revolution that occurred in the Cape Colony area. Two Irish guys were one of the sort of ringleaders of the slave revolution. One of them was executed. Then we have General John Francis Craddock, who's from Dublin. Sir Galbraith Lowray Cole, who was born in Dublin but is connected to Enniskillen. He's the second son of the Earl of Enniskillen. If you know Enniskillen, you know Cole's monument that towers over town, that's him. In South Africa, he's known as Sir Lowry. So he has a pass, there's Sir Lowry's Pass. It's if you go from the southern part of Cape Town and you want to go inland over the mountains, you go through Sir Lowry's Pass, Sir Lowry's Village. And there's several other areas in the Western Cape that are named after him. Like with Caledon, there's a river, Caledon River, Caledon Town. And then Sir Thomas Uppingham was known as the Afrikaner from Cork. These were all governor generals. To the point where when Sir Lowry came in on the boat in Cape Town, the local newspaper reported that someone in the crowd said, "Great, another Irishman come to rule over us," right? So there's this very strong presence, this sort of people that identified as Irish, the other people identified as Irish, sort of in charge, representing the British government. That's the Earl of Caledon on the right there. Early presence, a lot of the English-speaking presence in South Africa goes back to what are called the 1820 settlers. So what you had was this attempt by the British to Anglicize their new colony. This was under the governorship of Lord Charles Somerset. He's a guy who was very anti-Catholic, right? So he'd been instrumental in getting a prominent administrative figure from a Catholic background thrown out of his job, right? And in return, there was a conspiracy against him. He was really good friends with the famous James Barry, right? The guy who was born a woman in Cork and then spent his whole life as a man, became a medical surgeon in the British Army. They were really close. And so he got into a scandal where someone accused him of buggery with Sir James Barry, was eventually thrown out. But there's a lot of drama here. He was intent on bringing in English settlers. He also wanted to get mostly Protestants in. People coming in from Ireland tended to be more Catholic at this period, so he tried to segregate them. So there was a series of voyages, different numbers of people, total of about, I think it was about 500 people total, or no, 5,000 people total. There were about 350 Irish that came in separately, leaving out of Cork. And they landed in Saldanha Bay, which is just north of Cape Town, and headed to this town called Clan William. Used to be named after a Dutch farmer that was there. Lord Caledon, who was the Governor General, had changed the name of the town to honor his father-in-law, who was the Earl of Clan William in Tipperary. And so these Irish families went there. It's sort of up in the northern part of the Western Cape. Very difficult farming. They weren't very happy. All but 5 of the families, there were 20 families, all but 5 left. Most of them went to the Eastern Cape to Grahamstown. There were Irish soldiers there from the Enniskilling Fusiliers. That was where they were fighting the Cosa on the frontier. The soldiers built a Catholic church, St. Patrick's, which is still there, and a lot of the settlers sort of gravitated around that area. And so these were the 2 early settlements of Irish migrants in South Africa, and they're really the only examples of rural settlements. Most of the other Irish that came in settled in cities. There were other emigration schemes where people in Britain and Ireland were trying to organize getting people to go over. They tended to be poorly organized, badly financed, so the numbers were really small. If we look at the Irish in Cape Town, you had the military presence with Irish soldiers. There were a number of Irish regiments that were present in Cape Town during this period. And you have an Irish town developing around what was called the barracks. The barracks were right next to the castle that had been built by the Dutch. It's where the Dutch soldiers were quartered. It's where the British soldiers were then quartered. It's right in the city center now of Cape Town. And there were some of the people that connected to the military, other Irish people, sailors, people that were merchants and that would settle around the barracks. It became a sort of Irish town. They had a chapel by 1822, and by 1839 we have Bishop Patrick Raymond Griffith from Limerick, who bought the land for a cathedral. So it's Cathedral of St. Mary of the Flight into Egypt, and it's straight across the street from the Parliament in Cape Town. And that whole area there, which was also called Constitution Hill, was the sort of first Irish town. A little farther over to the east, there was a farm, a Dutch farm, called Zonnebloem, or Sunflower. And that became the next area where we saw a lot of Irish people move and establish themselves. There was a reorganization of Cape Town, a local administration at one point, dividing into districts. This became District 6, which is very famous because under apartheid, it was affected by the Group Areas Law and the people had to leave. By that point, what you had were Irish people settling, you had other people settling and mixing, right? So the local people that were there before the Dutch came in were the Khoikhoi and the San people. They mixed with the Dutch who came in, they mixed with the French Protestants who came in, with the Germans, and they mixed with the Irish as well. So this was a very mixed area. These people then in the 60s were kicked out. The district was raised except for the churches, right? And these people were then moved east of Cape Town in an area called the Cape Flats. And that's where you see the mixed population, which in South Africa they call the colored population, which as an American I have trouble saying. So the Afrikaners call them bruin mensen, the brown people. So brown is what I go with. So this is mostly brown people being kicked out. Farther to the east, there's another area that's the first suburb of Cape Town called Woodstock. And this was an area that had a beach front. And then up in the hills, there was the farm, part of the same farm. The farm was divided up, low-cost housing put in there. Eventually, the harbor was filled in, so the part that used to be the beach became sort of part of the port. And this became a sort of working class, mostly Irish area. St. Agnes on Dublin Street is sort of one of the remnants of this. This became one of these neighborhoods that changed over time. By the 1950s, 1960s, it became settled by Portuguese-speaking migrants from Madeira. So Most people in Cape Town call that Little Madeira, but it has a very long Irish history as well. The other part of Cape Town where we saw Irish is Robben Island. So Robben Island got an infirmary for lepers in 1846, and then a general infirmary mainly for people with mental disabilities. And a lot of Irish people came in and was the workforce. And they lived on the island. They set up, by the 1870s, there was an Irish town on Robben Island. And one of the few sort of visible markers of Irish presence in Cape Town is this Celtic cross on Robben Island that marks the cemetery. And this picture is from St. Patrick's Day this year. That's Darragh O'Brien, who's the Irish minister for, what is he minister of? Housing, Heritage, Local Government, and the Irish ambassador. So they, every St. Patrick's Day, go out to Robben Island and sort of stand by the cross and talk about Ireland's connection with South Africa. So there's a picture of Cape Town. The 1880s, it's sort of looking south, so it's upside down. You can see the castle, the areas that I've been talking about here. This is the, up here, this is the barracks, right? This is where you've got the Parliament Cathedral. This over here was Woodstock. 5 minutes, okay. Then you have the Dutch farm. This is a picture I took in March looking down to the city. You can see this area is Woodstock and that is the old Irish town. Reasons for the low numbers that are cited in literature, the price of the passage, which is true. Certainly if you compare it to North America, it has to do with how many, supply and demand and what was available and the distance. But certainly compared to Australia, the price wasn't any greater. Distance, right? The Suez Canal didn't open until 1869. So if you wanted to go from Ireland to Australia, you had to go right by Cape Town. So the distance argument isn't that convincing. The inhospitable climate, I'm not sure about because Cape Town is the same latitude south as Southern California is north. It's a very similar climate. It's very, very pleasant, certainly if you compare it to Canada. Right? Dutch Calvinist inhabitants, that wasn't a problem for Protestants. You had a strong Presbyterian presence from the 1820s. You had Lord Somerset, again, bringing in Scottish ministers to serve in the Dutch Reformed Church, which had been cut off from connections with the Netherlands for a while. They ended up integrating. There were negative views of Africa. You had the Seventh Xhosa War in the 1840s. You had this Bushmen show at the Rotunda in Dublin during the famine with all of these negative images. So there were lots of negative images about life in Africa. But I think it's troubles with assisted migration that are the big problem. And the story here, this is False Bay, this is Simonstown, this is Stanford. This relates to this anti-convict crisis of 1849-1850, where you essentially had the Attorney General, William Porter, who's seen as the father of Cape Town liberalism, originally from Derry, working with the bishop to raise money to help famine victims in Ireland. You had the Earl Grey scheme, right, to bring in Irish orphan girls out of Ireland, bring them to various places. The idea here was that you would organize assisted migration, and it would be the local governments that would help raise the funds to do that. There was a big uproar about this. There was upset that the ships that were coming in were having convicts on them. And the big issue here became this Neptune, the Neptune 3, that was bringing 300 people in. Some of them were young Irelanders who had been arrested. There were people who had been arrested early on in the famine for minor infractions. And the city rose up and there were protests. This is one of the protests here, saying we don't want this convict ship to come in. And so what you had was a boycott that lasted for 5 months where they wouldn't allow the ship people to leave the ship from Simonstown. The governor said we need help, right? John Mitchell, right, from sort of influence on the Fenians, one of the people on board. what you had was Robert Stanford, who was a local farmer, very prosperous, who talked to the governor general and said, okay, it's my duty as a British subject to do this, and supplied the ship. Did that for 5 months. Okay. Did that for 5 months and was ostracized to the point where his daughter was refused health treatment and died. He ended up going to London, pleading his case, was knighted and given £5,000. His house is still standing. They named the town, they sold his property and then named the town after him that they built him on. The effects of this, right, there were some additional schemes that weren't really that very effective. The effects of this sort of limiting of assisted immigration was that you had to pay your way to get to South Africa. Australia, about half of the migration in the 19th century was assisted. And so this kind of explains the low numbers. You get more Protestants than Catholics, more skilled and semi-skilled and unskilled from more developed parts of Ireland, male-dominated, and concentrated in certain professions, right? And because they were concentrated, they were very visible, high visibility, especially in things like retailing, which was dominated by Ulster Protestant businessmen. A lot of these stores have now gone away in that, but if you talk to any South African over like age 40, they know these names. They don't know they're Irish, right, but they know the names. Orange Order, National Fortress, both limited. You had a lot of cooperation, very little sectarian divisions here. You had lots of working together. Cape Town Irish Association, you had St. Patrick's Day celebrations in the cathedral with people from all different sides coming together. The other Irish town that you find in this area is Newlands, which is a southern suburb, right? Anglican church, built around a brewery. There was a brewery that was established by a Swedish immigrant that's still there. And you had an Irish workforce that lived in this suburb. Their cottages are now very like high-end real estate. People buy a couple of them, knock the walls down, build them together. The Cardiff Arms used to be the big social area that's now barristers. You can see the lion there. That means that it's getting the beer from the brewery, the local brewery. There it is on the map, built around springs, various springs. This was another area that became mixed and was cleared out in the 60s, right? And so what you had was a largely brown population that was pushed out, and then now it's sort of high-end, middle-class white population. Finally got to the Boer War. Typical American, I had no idea where the Boer War was fought in South Africa. Most of it was in Natal. In the Stellenbosch area, you found that there were remount stations where the British soldiers would take care of the horses, right, refresh the horses, refresh themselves. And there are a couple of the wine farms around Stellenbosch that were used for that. You could see that in Simlitzig, they actually have a brand of wine named after that. Neugedacht is just down the road, right? And you would have Irish soldiers that were part of this, especially since a lot of them worked on the horse, take care of the horses and that would then come back to South Africa after the war. Right? Today, what you find is very little presence of Irish. People don't know that the Irish were there. A lot of the mixed population that was kicked out of Cape Town now lives in that flats area. Most of them are brown people. And this last election, when you're driving around, I would see all kinds of political posters with clearly Irish names, right? As I could see that, but people didn't recognize it as such. You have the Celtic, the Irish cemetery with the Celtic cross on Robben Island. The only other two real monuments here, this is on Inniskilling Hill in Colenso, where you had the British forces trying to relieve Ladysmith, massive casualties. This is the monument to the Irish who fought on the other side, right? It was to the Irish volunteers. It was first put up in Johannesburg in 1975. 2002, a developer bought the property. They were afraid that they were going to tear it down. So it was taken to the city of Orania, which is this separatist Afrikaner, all whites only town. And they said, in anti-imperialist solidarity, we will move this. They loaded it on a truck and moved it. So now this monument to the Irish volunteers is up in the Northern Cape, staring out into the wilderness. So Ireland today uses soft power. It talks about its connection with South Africa because it's never been an invader or a colonizer. But what we see is there was, this idea that, the Irish were junior partners in British imperialism. They were part of this sort of exercise. And so the Irish have sort of been forgotten by South Africa, but you don't see the Irish government or Irish trying to remind people of this history either. Thanks. Sorry, I went over.
Thank you. Thank you very much for taking us to the Southern Hemisphere, Patrick. And I suppose the challenge while we change over here is to think about how the experience described by you there compares with the other experiences described. Patrick mentioned the magic name of Don Akenson to us, and it reminded me that when trying to come to grips with Irish migration studies, two names kept coming up all the time. Don Akenson for one, and I think Paddy mentioned it, was it last night or this morning? Kirby Miller. And we'd be here, so I think Kirby Miller he hasn't sent a representative, but his presence will be represented to us in the next session by Professor Brenda McSivney and his colleague, who are talking to us about the huge collection of letters, migrant letters that Kirby now digitized. But Don Akenson is also present in the form of. I don't know that you can describe yourself as his plenipotentiary, but certainly our next speaker, Rankin Sherling, is a former student of Don Akenson's, and those who know Don's reputation will know that's a recommendation in itself. So I'm not quite sure what you're going to tell us about where you're going to find these Presbyterians, Rankin, but we're very interested to hear what you say. So please give him a round of applause, ladies and gentlemen.
All right, I'll try not to let Dr. Akenson down after that. It's really nice to be here again. I've been here three different points. The first was in 2008. I was here for 7 days doing some research for the book that eventually came out from that research, and met these fine fellows here. Is Patty here? Did he leave? Okay, yeah. I just have to tell the story once again. Not having been here before, I was staying in a hostel on the outside of Oma. I believe maybe on the other side of Oma. Anyway, I found out where the Mellon Center of Migration Studies was and walked here because I was poor. And Patty found that out and says, "Well, how long are you staying here?" I said, "Well, it's 7, 8 days." He says, "Look, I've got to open up at, 8 or 9, whatever it was." He's like, "If I swing by every morning, I'll give you will you be ready? I'll give you a ride." So he gave me a ride here every day for 7 or 8 days, whatever it was. And I stayed until he closed up and went back. And so I have very fond memories that way of this place. But also the last time I was here, I happened to mention that in the meantime, in 2016, at this symposium, I had found out that many of my family are from North Tyrone. I did not know that at the time. And afterwards, William Rolston came up to me and said, "Is that me?" Okay.
You had a stopwatch for that. I tried to get it off.
It's Akenson on the line.
Get it together. So William came up to me after the talk and said, "What part of North Tyrone are your people from?" And I said, "I can't remember." But he walked me through it, and we got to the parish of Achadoe, and then somewhere else, Donaghady, and then it's Achadoe is part of that.
Carrickatane.
And then Carrickatane. So we had to do it again. But I did know that it was one of the last thatch-roofed homes maintained by the government in the north of Ireland, and we went straight to the home. So that was amazing. William brought me to that. I saw this place where my grandmother had wanted to come her whole life but never got to come. All of these things. Her grandfather would have been born there. His two brothers were both Civil War veterans, and one was died of his wounds after the war. One died in a prison camp in Elmira, New York, Anthony. And so it's quite a special place. Since then, William and I have found out that we're distant cousins. So, it just, the North Tyrone stuff keeps giving and giving. The name of this talk is The Invisible Irish, Finding Presbyterians. Obviously, in one sense, Presbyterians in Ireland don't need to be found. One very strident but not helpful book reviewer had this to say, Irish Presbyterians are hardly invisible. Thank you. That's, very helpful. That's not the type of invisibility I'm talking about. I'm talking about in the 19th century migrations to the United States. They're very difficult to find in the larger Irish migration. Irene Whalen, some of you will know her, wrote that Irish Protestant immigration to the U.S. did not cease in the 18th century, but we know little or nothing about those who left Ireland after 1800. So she's right about that, and there are several reasons for that. Of course, many historians, both especially in the traditionalist Irish historians of America, for a long time did not consider Irish Protestants to be part of the Great Irish Migration. So that's part of it. That started to change, as many of you will know. The biggest problem, though, is the census data in the United States. The census cannot ask a mandatory religion question. It's against the U.S. Constitution to do something like that. And people would be very reticent to give religious information about themselves to the government in the United States, which makes finding Irish immigrants in America based on religion on a large scale almost impossible. So we're left with, if you just use American data, you're left with the method that Kirby Miller has used, and many others, which is to use letters, many letters. The problem with that can be, and I think we'll hear maybe a little bit more of that later there with you two, is that you might pull a false impression from letters. You may get a group of people who are more educated and they can write letters, and so they can write a story of the Irish in a way that others would disagree with had they been able to write. There's just lots of problems that possibly could arise from that method, although great things as well. But I'm talking about, if you want to say Protestant Irish or Presbyterian Irish in America were X or Y or Z as a whole. It's difficult. You need a larger body of data to do that. Atkinson attempted to use the Canadian data, which are the best in the world based on that. So if you really want to know about how Irish acted with their feet, where they settled, what professions they got into, look at Canada. They have the best data in the 19th century, I mean. Okay, so the problem with that is, the response could be, well, that's just in Canada. The United States is not like that. And you do get historians saying that sort of thing. Well, it may be like that in Canada or South Africa or wherever, but that's not the way it is in the United States. And we sometimes call that sort of tongue-in-cheek Irish American exceptionalism. So you got this situation in the historiography where the Irish Presbyterians, or Scotch Irish, or Ulster Scots, or Scots Irish, or the people with no name, or God's frontiersmen, you know all of the names, are the most studied ethnic group in what would become the United States during the colonial period, by far. There's more studies done on them than anybody else. And then almost none in the 19th century. But people have started to see for a good long while, it looks like the overall gross numbers of Presbyterian migrants to the United States was increasing, not ending. after the American Revolution. Many of the famous historians of colonial Presbyterian or Ulster migration to America have stopped at 1775. So that becomes a break. It doesn't stop after that. In fact, it increases after that. And as far as anybody, to my knowledge, has been able to do this well is 1815. So you have a fairly well-studied group from in the 18th century, the long 18th century, and almost nothing in the 19th century, which is something that I call historiographical polarity. Okay, so what do you do to try to find these migrants? What I did, and then I'll move on to these migrants in the Great Famine and see what it might be able to tell us about Presbyterian migration in the famine. What I did was I found Presbyterian ministers, as many ministers as I could find. Ministers, licentiates, in some cases, what I call clerical migrants, divinity students who went over to Princeton and became Presbyterian ministers. I found 616 of these people from 1683 to 1901. Most of them are from the 19th century, but I took the ones that corresponded chronologically with the large sort of corpus of study on the Scotch-Irish from 1683 to 1811 and compared those two groups. So I took the ministers, looked for trends, compared them with known trends amongst Presbyterians, Scotch-Irish, in America, and found three distinct one-to-one relationships: places of origin, settlement patterns in America, and peak years in migration. Now, there's some variation in migration years, general peaks and ministerial peaks. Every now and again, you might get a peak in ministerial migration and then migration, or then general migration, or vice versa. But essentially, you have those three, and I spend most of the book pointing out this relationship because the relationship is very important. If the relationship there doesn't exist, then you can't really draw that much from what you can find about ministers in the 19th century. All right, so what I found was that if my theory is correct, the highest levels of Presbyterian migration from Ireland to America will be found not before the American Revolution, but during the Great Famine, during the famine years. And so I'm just going to read a little bit here of research on clerical migrants from Ireland to America in the famine years. For me, it's 46 to 54. Those dates are variable. I'll defer to Christine, but you can see a peak on the graph there from 46 to 54. These clerical migrants are leaving in droves. And then we should see, when research is done and can be done, something to confirm this. And Kirby Miller, in fact, I'm going to end with a quote from Kirby Miller that seems to confirm that. All right, so from the already high levels between 1811 and 1845, Irish Presbyterian clerical migration increased once again between 1846 and 54, rising to its ultimate heights during these years of the Great Famine. A total of 68 clerical migrants arrived during the famine years, an average of over 7 per year. The levels were so high that clerical migration during the famine can be considered one great peak. But within that great peak, not surprisingly, the highest years were 1847 with 12, 1848 with 8, 1849 with 13, 1850 with 11, and 1853 with 8. In just these 5 years alone, 52 clerical migrants left Ireland for the United States. These are all Presbyterians. Throughout the entire period from 1683 to 1901, nothing like these levels of yearly clerical migration had ever occurred or would ever occur again. So this is the climax for sure in Irish Presbyterian clerical migration. Of the 68 clerical migrants of this period, the origins of 15 can be narrowed down only as far as Ireland, but for the other 49, nearly 77%, their origins can be traced to the county level. At least 13 Irish counties were represented in the clerical migration of the famine years. Again, and this is something that had changed in the clerical migration over time, the clerical migrants at first usually came from Donegal or Derry or Tyrone, sometimes Monaghan. But in 1770, and many of you will know that things start to change a bit in 1770, that shifts to Antrim and Down. So again here, Antrim and Down contributed the most migrants, and Ulster continued to be the main producer of clerical migrants. But once again, all 4 Irish provinces produced immigrants. 8 counties from Ulster, 3 from Leinster, 1 from Connacht, and 1 from Munster were represented. However, the breakdown by number of migrants was more lopsided. 43 migrants were from Ulster and only 6 were from the other 3 provinces combined. 4 from Leinster, 1 from Munster, 1 from Connacht. As it had been since 1683, this was largely an Ulster phenomenon. Presbyterian migration was largely an Ulster phenomenon. Some trends in U.S. settlement patterns also remain similar. There is settlement information for 57 of the 68 migrants, and clear patterns are easily discernible, as the work of Marianne Wojcik and Peter Gilmore will show if you haven't read their work. That this area that expands from the Delmarva Peninsula, which Dan talked about earlier, this is the area that's attracting Irish Presbyterians, even in the era where most Irish migrants might be hitting Boston or New York. So when harbors in states like Massachusetts and New York were choked with Irish immigrants, the clear dominance of Pennsylvania as a U.S. destination for Irish Presbyterian clerical migrants is evident. New York was a distant second, although less so than the earlier years in the 19th century. New York as a major destination for clerical migrants was a trend that began to manifest itself only in the 1790s. So before that, New York wasn't even on the map really. By the time of the famine, it had been the norm for about 6 decades for New York to be the second place. Of the 57 migrants with known settlement information during the period, 53, or 92.9%, spent time in either Pennsylvania or New York, and together the 2 states accounted for 53 of the 113 settlements by state of these migrants. Some of them settled in different states, moved around between 1846 and 54. The greater Delmarva states, my term for the place of settlement slowly expanding from around the Delmarva Peninsula, continued to receive more clerical migrants in the period of the Great Irish Famine than any other region in the U.S., and again, this is mainly due to the high numbers received by Pennsylvania. Combined, the region received 87.7%, or 50 of the 57 migrants with available settlement information. Okay, thank you. Clerical Presbyterian immigrants experienced other aspects of migration that Irish immigrants are known to have faced as well. One famine immigrant minister, the Reverend John Hawthorne, died on a quarantine ship off Montreal on his way to Ohio. A familiar tale for historians of the famine Irish in North America, but one not usually associated with Irish Presbyterian ministers. Such fates are often associated with the poorest of the poor arriving from Ireland. But here we see that death in quarantine was not always reserved for the ragged and the wretched, nor for just the Catholic, as is the implication from the often told tale of the Irish in North America. So what you're seeing here are some patterns, and what it says to me is that the Ulster migration of Presbyterians, the Presbyterian migration out of Ulster to America during this time was large. It came from the counties that you would expect the counties to be, and it's completely underrepresented by the story of the Irish in America, or maybe just the outmigration of the Irish in general. And I'd like to read just another little bit here. This is from Kirby Miller. He's done some fascinating work with letters, but he also has done with Liam Kennedy some really good work on demographic data. From the period of the Great Famine, the cataclysm that purportedly confirms both the Ulster Protestants and the American Scotch-Irish in their sense of natural separateness from and divinely ordained superiority to Irish Catholics. Between 1841 and 51, the population of the overwhelmingly Protestant and Presbyterian parish of, now I don't know how to pronounce this, Kilwater, in mid-Antrim fell 36%. A decline comparable to those experienced in some of the most impoverished Catholic districts of Munster and Connacht. In the nearby parishes of Glenweary, Rallue, Killygallen Grange, all with similarly large Protestant and Presbyterian majorities, the populations fell by 1/4 to 1/5 during the same period. Moreover, between 1831 and 1861, in the 3 decades spanning the famine crisis, the Presbyterian population of 9-county Ulster declined by 18%. This was almost precisely the same proportional decrease that Ulster's Catholics experienced, whereas by contrast, the Norse Anglican population fell only by 13%. In every Ulster county except for Mana, proportional losses among Presbyterians in 1831 to 61 were greater, often substantially greater, than among Anglicans, and only in Antrim and Down were Presbyterian attrition rates less, and there only slightly less, than among Catholics. Looking at mid-Ulster, between 1831 and 1861, the Anglican population of County Armagh fell merely 8%, the Catholic population by 16%, while the Presbyterian population declined by a startling 31%. So what he's doing, looking at a different set of data, is showing the same thing. We're drawing the same conclusion. These famine years were massive in terms of Presbyterian loss from Ulster. In fact, Kirby Miller will go on to say that, in fact, while many of these counties became more Protestant during that time, they became less Presbyterian, much more Anglican. And so I think that's, both of these ways are good ways of getting around these problems that we have from the U.S. Census. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we now turn to the last contribution in this session, and it's very interesting. We've now listened to, I think, if I've added it up right, 10 top-flight presentations, top scholarship. And now we turn in a slightly different direction to look at the question of what do you do with the fruits of scholarship? How does this get mediated to a wider public? And this is the wonderful thing about the location of the Centre for Migration, the Mellon Centre here. We're located, co-located, with one of the most powerful mechanisms for communicating the fruits of scholarship to a wide public audience in an outdoor museum. And we're now going to introduce to you somebody who's got the job of wrestling with this problem of how to mediate the fruits of scholarship to the wide public through the mechanism of this wonderful museum here. So please give a welcome to, this is Dr. Pauline Gardiner, who is in charge of, is education officer here in National Museums Northern Ireland at the Ulster American Folk Park, and she's going to talk to us about the interpretive challenges of working on this site.
I was a bit worried there that Brian was going to say we've had all these wonderful presentations and now we're taking a really deep dive down low.
Quite the reverse.
So my name is Pauline. I'm the education officer here at the Folk Park, and I've been here for 5 years. And previous to that, I worked in the community sector, both with tangible and intangible cultural heritage. And I've been lucky enough to work with both Irish language organisations and Ulster Scots organisations. So I feel I have a really nice view of both sides of the coin. But what I really want to talk to you about today is how we teach the famine here on the folk park, and the type of challenges that we find on a daily basis when we're working with school groups that come in. So as a Museum of Migration, we are uniquely placed to deliver learning programmes that deal with the Great Famine or in Irish and Gortamore. No other of our museum sites in National Museums and I have a dedicated famine learning programme, so we're very unique in that aspect of it. So the famine programme that we offer here is designed for Key Stage 2 pupils, so principally Primary 6 and Primary 7, and for our friends from across the pond, this equates to 10 and 11-year-old kids. It's directly connected to the curriculum, so it supports the thematic unit within the curriculum of famine, and it also supports ideas for connected learning for needs and wants with P6s and P7s. So within Northern Ireland, we have what we call the big picture of the curriculum, and it's quite fluid, and while there's certain topics that have to be taught, the teachers have a lot of freedom in what they take from those topics and how they teach them. So for example, within the idea of the famine thematic unit, they might decide to teach the history of the Great Famine. They might decide to look at contemporary famines. They might decide to look at food poverty, or they might decide to look at a combination of them. They also have the freedom to choose not to do that topic at all. And one of the teachers that were in with us for this morning for a workshop programme was saying that she doesn't teach the Great Famine, but what she does is she brings that education topic into different aspects of what she's doing. So in class, if they're doing literacy, they might read Under the Hawthorn Tree, or they're doing the topic of Victorians, so they might look at the famine through that aspect. But what we've kind of noticed from speaking with teachers that are coming in is that for many of them, the decision whether or not they teach the famine in school is down to the relationship that that teacher has with the topic. So lots of them will come and say to us, I did it at school and I loved it, so now I'm teaching it in my classroom. So they have a very emotional connection to the subject, and they want to bring that to the kids that they're teaching today. But this is where one of our first problems comes up, is that issue of legacy within teaching. And we can see that coming through in the interactions that we have with kids. So preparing for today, I thought to myself, well, let's have a look at the past year and see what schools come into us to do our famine programme. So I did the very scientific thing of putting famine into my calendar and seeing what it brought up. Now the caveat I'll say is that some of our workshops are booked with the full title of the famine programme, some will just be initials. But that aside, from October to June, so the time that we have schools in, over 75% of the schools that were undertaking famine workshops here were from a maintained background. So essentially they are Catholic schools that are being managed by the Catholic Church. Less than 15% of schools coming in were controlled schools. So these are schools who are essentially but not exclusively Protestant. The remaining 10% or so were made up of visitors who came from integrated primary schools or home educated pupils. And we also find similar numbers when we're looking at our online Museum on the Move programme. So while we can't say that Protestant schools are not engaging with the topic, it does suggest that with respect to the famine, these schools are not engaging to the same extent as Catholic schools, and certainly not to the extent where they are taking the opportunity to supplement their classroom learning with externally provided educational opportunities. So why is this? A study at Queen's University found that even from a very early age, young people begin to assimilate a variety of cultural symbols and practices which help them construct a narrative of self-identity. They're influenced by things that they perceive to be of cultural value, such as their social background and the place that they live. And while today's young people are growing up in a period of very relative stability in Northern Ireland, the key cultural symbols such as murals, memorials, slogans and flags are ever present in their everyday lives. An earlier study by Ulster University exploring history identity in the curriculum recognises the integral part that history plays in the popular consciousness in Northern Ireland, particularly with regards to foundation myths and those very partisan myths of heroism, martyrdom, treachery and intolerance that we see coming through. So this empirical study aimed to evaluate the extent to which pupils from both community backgrounds had connected historical events and themes to their own sense of identity. And while pupils from maintained schools regularly identified the famine as part of their cultural identity, none of the pupils from the controlled schools identified the famine at all. Instead, they identified with events such as the Battle of the Somme, or the Siege of Derry, or the Home Rule crisis. So there is a prevailing perception within the community that the famine is a historical event that belongs to one side more so than another. So on a recent visit that we had from a school here was a Catholic maintained school that was situated exactly on the peace line in the interface area in Belfast. And the children were deeply, deeply engaged in the topic and incredibly highly knowledgeable about what they'd learned in the classroom. But as part of our programme here, we do a group activity where children have a chance to discuss things. And during the discussion, myself and my team members overheard some comments that the children were making. So they were saying things like, well, the famine didn't affect Protestants, and Protestants didn't immigrate during the famine. They were saying things like, but Protestant people aren't Irish, they're all English. Similarly, a pupil from a school in Derry, I had done an online learning programme with him, and he'd come into the museum then with his class leader, and we were having a wee break, and this 10-year-old child very confidently strolled up to me and went, "My dad said you're a liar." Now, I'm from Derry, so I'm frantically looking at this child going, do I know your father? Have I met him somewhere? What does he look like? And I kind of said, well, why would he say that? And he said, because you said there was a famine in Ireland, and there wasn't a famine in Ireland. And he went so far as to say, my dad said anybody who says that is an agent of the British state. Now, this is a 10-year-old child, deeply, deeply politicised. So while one of the schools was in Belfast and the other one was in Derry, what they had in common was location. So they were both in deeply isolated, heavily politicised communities with high levels of social deprivation and little to no positive interaction with people from the other community. And children growing up in these areas are deeply influenced by informal learning, what they hear at home, what they hear from their peers, what they see painted on gable walls, and their own lived experiences. So as such, as educators, it's really important that we are aware of any unintended consequences of any history programme that we deliver, particularly in the ways that pupils from diverse backgrounds interact with the information that we give them. So in addition to the challenges that arise from community perceptions, we also have physical interpretation challenges with the museum site itself. So the previous famine learning programme here at the museum was delivered across almost all the houses that you'll see on the Irish side of the park, and it was entirely based on Marita Conlon McKinnon's emotive novel Under the Hawthorn Tree. And while many schools use that as a learning tool, some opt not to do that. So by using the Hawthorn Tree narrative as the basis of our education programme, we're excluding a lot of schools who weren't studying that book, and we're limiting our audience even further. Additionally, in a practical term, using so many of the buildings and so many visitor guides meant that the programme was really unsustainable, and it operated at a significant financial loss, particularly for our visitor services team. So instead, the current programme is much more condensed with fewer locations around the park, and we have hands-on active learning based upon archive sources and the building themselves. The programme is delivered by myself, my education team, and it's really strongly mapped to the curriculum with specified learning aims and objectives. So within the classroom, the living conditions of the poor is covered quite a lot by the teacher, and they will also encourage the children to make small models of famine cottages and buildings. So they're very similar to our own single room cabin that we have here, so that's the perfect spot for us to start. It provides us with an opportunity to take that classroom-based learning and put it into a real life context. So the children are effectively sharing the same space that a poor cottier family and his family would have lived in. We're setting the scene for them effectively. So while the famine cabin, the single room cabin, was installed at the folk park specifically as a famine cabin, over time that kind of narrative got a wee bit more diluted, and the dominant story became that of the Divine family. And this is a very entertaining narrative for our general visitors, but the fact is we don't know who lived in the cabin or how many people were, because this was a poor family and poor family didn't keep records, so we can't say for certain. So it's really important to us that we provide our schools with a very authentic and relevant experience that builds upon that things that they're doing in the classroom. So what we wanted to do was remove the divines from the picture, and instead we brought in some source material. So we devised a small role play that's based upon testimony from the Devon Commission. And one child comes forward and they dress up as the commissioner, and the other child is the occupant of the cabin, and they have a small interview. And this interview provides an enormous amount of information that the children can kind of take and assimilate before they go inside the cabin. It allows them to be really active participants in their learning. I have to mention too our fantastic guides. So before they go into the cabin, we'll kind of usually say to the kids, well, what do you think it's going to be like in there? And they'll say disgusting and smelly and dirty, and our fabulous guide will stand at the corner with a face of absolute pretend disgust and offence that the kids are going to say that. So whenever they go inside, they have a look around the cabin, and we come outside, then we move on to the lazy beds. And there we give a discussion about why is the potato such a good foodstuff for these poor cottier classes. And we introduce more source material, and we also bring in an interactive sensory element, which is a fantastic scent cube that I haven't brought in with me today because it is very, very potent. And there wouldn't be many of you left. You're very welcome. But if anybody is desperate to try it, I do have it in my office and I can bring it out later. So this is based on the testimony of a land agent called William Trench. And William describes a stench that filled the atmosphere of every field of potatoes. And he talks about how the crop of all crops on which the poor depended for food had suddenly melted away. So this is given a testimony, first person testimony, and we're providing them with that sensory connection to that testimony. So that's at number 1, and from there we move on to number 13, which is our schoolhouse, Castletown National School, that opened in 1845. So far the cabin, the lazy bed and the school fits nicely within our famine education narrative. It also means that we keep the kids quite condensed, so there's a very practical element of education programming, sometimes a bit like herding cats. So if we keep them to a small area of the park, it's easier to keep control of them. So inside the schoolhouse they do a group activity, and this brings concepts of assisted migration and chain migration, and also educate to emigrate. So the activity here is designed so that they can argue their own point of view but reach a consensus with the group. And they're given some information on cards, and they have to look at the information and decide which one of them is best suited to make the journey to America. And they'll look at things like the age of the person. Are they going to survive to the journey's end? Or if they have any school skills or education that they can carry with them. And they will then decide which person is going to get their ticket. So it also involves a bit of dress up for the kids. And it was really important for us to bring a really active, fun element into the workshop as well, because it's a very, very serious topic, and it keeps it nice and light, and it keeps the kids engaged. And it also combats what my education team and I kind of colloquially call famine fatigue, because at very busy times of the year, we are regularly delivering multiple back-to-back workshops, 4 days a week for weeks on end. So that's quite telling on us as well, and it can be quite exhausting trying to keep that really high energy levels up. So from the schoolhouse we move into the town area, and our focus here is the ship gallery. So again, we have to make sure that we're presenting an accurate enough picture for the kids, but we're going into a ship gallery that has a ship from 1816 in it. So how do we make that make sense for the kids? And as soon as they see it, they go coffin ship, and we kind of say, well, it's not a coffin ship, but it gives us a really good example of what that experience might be like. It's often the highlight of any school visit, so by the time they reach the ship, these kids are like bouncing about like crazy. So we need to find a way of really bringing that energy back down and refocusing on the education. One of the ways we do that is we bring in another piece of historical evidence. So there is a fantastic letter, series of letters actually, that Ronan, our good friend here, who used to be part of my team, found in the database that's here in the centre. And it's from a man called Henry Johnson. And Henry's a bit of a character because he was a merchant from Antrim, and apparently had a few debtors on his tail, so he thought the best thing to do would be jump off in 1848 and head off to Canada. But he writes to his wife, and this is the letter he wrote. One poor family in the next birth to me, whose father had been ill all of the time, of a bowel complaint I thought great pity of. He died the first night of the storm, and he was laid outside his berth. The ship began to pitch and roll dreadfully. After a while, the boxes, barrels and cargo began to roll from one side to another, and the men at the helm were thrown from the wheel, and the ship became unmanageable. At this time, I was pitched right onto the corpse. The poor mother and 2 daughters were thrown on top of us, and there the corpse, box, barrels, women, children, and I, all in one mess, were knocked about from one side to another for 15 minutes. Dear Jane, shortly after the ship got righted and the captain came down, and we sewed the body up and took it on deck, and amid the raging of the storm, he read the funeral service for the dead and we pitch the body overboard. So you can see how this really emotive first-person testimony can really bring the energy levels of the children down and really, really get them to focus on what we want them to do. And what we want them to focus on is empathy. We want them to have a sense of empathy in the past. So we've now reached what for us is the most challenging part of the site, and that's that we're moving from the ship into the American side, and now essentially we're following the Mellon migration story, and that's not relevant to our kids who are here to study the famine. There's no buildings at the minute on the American side of the park that we can take the children to as the next logical step in the journey, so exploring the experiences of famine migrants in densely populated urban areas. So as a result, our workshop finishes in the ship gallery, and we conclude with one question to the group, and that is, why is it important we learn about this today? It's so incredibly encouraging for us to see how coherently and how quickly many of the children can make the connections between what happened in the past and what they're seeing in the contemporary world today. So what they're seeing on their screens and what they're hearing in the news, they get it, and they can equate that what people in Ireland were fleeing from the famine, there are people today that are still fleeing their homes, and a lot of them will have people within their school community who've had to make those very difficult journeys. So the decision's then left to the teacher: break for lunch or go off into the American side of the park. But this effectively provides a bit of a reset button for the class, because their facilitated element of their visit is over and they're now free to explore the park as much as they like with the teacher. But the downside of that is the class don't have the opportunity to take that third and final step in the leaving, journey, arriving process. So moving forward for us, Bad Bridget has been incredibly successful in providing that missing urban and indeed female narrative. And while the design interpretation of the exhibition is highly, highly appealing to children, unfortunately for us, the subject matter isn't appropriate for our primary school kids. So when Bad Bridget leaves us, we have fantastic plans that we're going to install a new exhibition that focuses solely on the experiences of children during the famine. And this is going to bring an entirely new experience for our schools with really deep layers of interpretation and learning. We're currently working towards living our famine programme as Gaeilge in Irish, and we're developing a suite of online digital learning resources that will be free for all schools to access. We're designing a famine workshop which supports learning at Key Stage 3, so that's years 8, 9 and 10 at secondary level, or ages 11 to 14. We've been working really closely with Jason King at the Irish Heritage Trust to secure funding for a cross-border project where the outcome will be a collaborative educational video entitled Teaching the Famine, Educational Outreach in Museums. And that will include the role here of the education team and the learning activities that we do in the park. Discussion regarding development plans for the site, and I'm looking at Liam here hopefully, have also included the possibility of a tenement room exhibition accessed from the American side of the park, which provide an insight into life in urban areas and ultimately allow our school pupils to complete their famine journey. The bigger challenge, however, is changing the notion that the famine fits only one community narrative. Going back to the research that was conducted by Ulster University, pupils who study history at secondary level will draw selectively from the curriculum in order to bolster their developing understanding of historical narrative and inform their own sense of identity. This is particularly relevant in pupils from areas that have high levels of social deprivation or have experienced conflict. But it's important that we recognise that many of the beliefs start much, much earlier in children's lives. Museums and other cultural and heritage institutions have a crucial role to play in providing formal learning opportunities that help young people develop perspectives on the past that are grounded in inquiry, evidence and multiple viewpoints, all explicit goals of the history curriculum. But more importantly, as museum educators, we must also be prepared to provide a clear alternative to the histories that young people may be encountering elsewhere and rise to those challenges in interpretation. Thank you.
It could be London, Glasgow or New York. You pass me by on the street, like a word on the page, fading with age, that I've written but no one will read. Now is the hour, now is the day. We take what we gather and set on our way. And hope for what's better, that's what people say. But words can't do nothing to keep tears mountains, cross over the streams, walk in the footsteps of others who've dreamed. Take your bag from the fire, your coat from the door, keep a light in the window. Take your bag from the fire, your coat from the door, keep a light in the window to find a way home. Home, to find your way